The first gunshot cracked through the morning air as Grace Keller urged her horses forward, the loaded wagon creaking in protest beneath her. Panic surged in her chest, not at the distant sound of violence, which had become all too familiar in her 22 years, but at the sickening lurch of the wagon as the rear axle finally gave way, something she'd been dreading for the past 40 miles. "Whoa there, easy now," she called to her team of horses, pulling back on the reins as the wagon listed dangerously to one side. The animals whinnied in confusion, coming to an uncertain halt on the dusty trail that would eventually lead to North Platte, Nebraska, if she ever managed to get there. The year was 1873, and the promise of a new life waited for her just beyond the horizon. A life away from the pain of Chicago, away from the memories of a family lost to fever, away from the whispers that followed a young woman who had refused the advances of a powerful man. North Platte represented something precious, a chance to begin again. Grace climbed down from the driver's bench, her boots hitting the hard, packed earth with a thud. The prairie stretched around her in every direction, an ocean of swaying grass under the vast blue Nebraska sky. She was at least 15 miles from town, with nothing but wilderness between her and civilization. "Just perfect," she muttered, kneeling to examine the damage. The wooden axle had splintered completely, the wheel tilting at an impossible angle. Her father had taught her many things: how to shoot, how to bargain, how to keep accounts, but wagon repair had never been among those lessons. Grace straightened, brushing the dust from her simple blue dress. She could unhitch the horses and ride one into town, but that would mean abandoning her wagon filled with everything she owned in this world out here in the open, prey to any passing thieves or the elements themselves. The alternative was to wait and hope someone happened along this lonely stretch of trail. The sun was climbing higher, promising a scorching day ahead. Grace pulled her wide-brimmed hat lower over her eyes and retrieved her canteen from the wagon. As she took a careful sip of the tepid water, her attention caught on a cloud of dust rising in the distance. A rider was approaching from the west from the direction of North Platte. Grace hesitated only a moment before reaching for her father's revolver tucked beneath the driver's seat. She checked the chambers loaded, as always, and slipped it into the pocket of her dress, keeping her hand close. The frontier was no place for a woman to take chances. As the rider drew nearer, Grace could make out a tall figure on a chestnut horse. A man with broad shoulders, his face shadowed by a worn Stetson. He slowed his mount as he spotted her stranded wagon, approaching with a caution that suggested he was as wary of strangers as she was. "Appears you've got yourself some trouble, madam," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "Nothing I can't handle," Grace replied, her chin lifting slightly. The stranger chuckled, a warm sound that somehow didn't seem mocking. He stopped his horse a respectful distance away. "Mind if I take a closer look? I've fixed my share of broken axles." Grace studied him. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes the color of the prairie sky in summer. His clothes were those of a working man, worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, and a leather vest that had seen better days. "And who might you be?" she asked, not moving from her position beside the wagon. "Daniel Baxter," he answered, touching the brim of his hat. "Most folks call me Dan. I work at the Wilson Ranch just outside North Platte." He gestured toward her damaged wagon. "That axle won't fix itself, and it's a long walk to town." Grace hesitated. Her instincts told her this man wasn't a threat, but she'd learned to be cautious. Still, she had few options. "Grace Keller," she finally offered. "I'd be obliged for the help, Mr. Baxter." "Just Dan, please," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. He tied his horse and approached the wagon, removing his hat as he neared her. Up close, she noticed the laugh lines around his eyes and a small scar that ran along his jawline. "You're a fair piece from town, Miss Keller, traveling alone." His tone was conversational, but she could hear the underlying concern. "Yes," she answered simply, not elaborating. Her reasons for traveling unaccompanied were her own. Dan nodded, respecting her reticence. He crouched beside the broken axle, examining the damage. "You're lucky," he said after a moment. "I've got some tools in my saddlebag, and there's enough of the old axle left that I can make a temporary repair. It won't get you far beyond North Platte, but it'll hold till you reach town." "I'd appreciate that," Grace said, relaxing slightly. "North Platte is my destination anyway." Dan looked up with interest. "Moving there?" Grace nodded. "I've purchased the old millinery shop on Front Street, planning to reopen it. Eliza Wilson's place, been closed for near a year now." Dan stood, brushing the dust from his hands. "Town could use a good hat shop. Ladies have been ordering through catalogs or making the trip to Omaha." "That's what I'm counting on," Grace said. Her savings wouldn't last forever, and she needed the business to succeed. "Let me get my tools," Dan said, returning to his horse. Grace watched as he retrieved a small but well-maintained set of tools from his saddlebags. There was something reassuring about his methodical movements, the confident way he assessed the problem. He worked quietly, pausing only to ask her for a particular item from the wagon or to explain what he was doing. "Been on the trail long?" he asked as he positioned a block of wood to lift the wagon's weight off the broken axle. 5 days from Omaha," Grace replied, handing him a rope he'd requested. "Almost 3 weeks total since leaving Chicago." "Chicago," Dan whistled low. "That's quite a journey for anyone, let alone a woman alone." Grace bristled slightly. "I'm perfectly capable, Mr. Baxter." "Never suggested otherwise," he said, glancing up with a hint of a smile. "Just admiring your grit. Not everyone has the courage to start fresh somewhere new." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "What about you?" she asked, changing the subject. "Are you from North Platte originally?" Dan shook his head. "Missouri born and raised, came west after the war, needed open spaces and fresh air after everything." The way his voice trailed off told Grace he'd seen combat. So many men had, and many came west afterward, seeking something they'd lost on the battlefields. "You found what you were looking for here?" she asked softly. Dan paused in his work, looking out across the prairie. "Most days, I think so." He returned to the axle, measuring a piece of wood he'd pulled from his saddlebag. "North Platte's a good town, growing every day with the railroad." "Good people for the most part." "For the most part," Grace raised an eyebrow. "Every place has its share of trouble," Dan said with a shrug. "But Sheriff Miller keeps things peaceful enough." They fell into a companionable silence as Dan continued his work. The sun climbed higher and Grace retrieved her canteen again, offering it to him. Their fingers brushed as he accepted it, a brief contact that nonetheless sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Much obliged," he said after taking a drink. When he passed it back, his eyes met hers directly for the first time. They were kind eyes, she decided, with a depth that spoke of experiences beyond his years. It took nearly 2 hours for Dan to complete the repair, fashioning a temporary axle reinforcement from materials in his saddlebag and pieces salvaged from the wagon. Grace helped where she could, holding tools and following his instructions. "That should hold," he said finally, standing back to inspect his work. His shirt clung to his back with sweat and dirt smudged his face. "You'll need to take it slow, though. No racing into town." Grace laughed her first genuine laugh in weeks. "I wasn't planning on it." Dan smiled in response, and Grace noticed how it transformed his face, making him look younger, more carefree. "Tell Henry at the livery to replace the axle proper. He's honest and won't overcharge a newcomer." "Thank you," Grace said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. She took a small step back, straightening her skirts. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Baxter." "Dan," he corrected gently. "And there's no debt. Anyone would have done the same." Grace wasn't so sure about that. She'd encountered plenty of people on her journey who wouldn't have stopped to help a lone woman. She reached into her pocket, withdrawing a small coin purse. "Please, let me pay you for your time and materials." Dan shook his head. "Keep your money. You'll need it getting started in a new place." He hesitated, looking at her with a mixture of uncertainty and something else she couldn't quite name. "But I would ask one thing if you'd allow it." Grace tensed slightly. "And what would that be?" the trail can be dangerous, especially for someone traveling alone. Would you mind if I rode alongside you to town, just to make sure that axle holds? Relief flooded through her. It was a sensible request and one that spoke well of his character. She'd already determined he was no threat to her, and having company for the remainder of the journey would be welcome. I'd appreciate the escort, she said. Thank you. Dan's smile widened and he reached for his hat. Just let me get my horse. As Grace climbed back onto the wagon seat, she found herself smiling too. Perhaps this unexpected delay was a stroke of luck after all, introducing her to her first friend in her new home. The wagon moved forward with a groan but held steady as they began the journey toward North Platte. Dan rode alongside, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the area. His presence was comforting in the vast expanse of the prairie, and Grace found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since leaving Chicago. See that ridge there? Dan pointed to a distant line of hills. Local Pawnees say that's where the sky spirits come down to walk among men. Do you believe that? Grace asked, genuinely curious. Dan shrugged. I believe there are things in this world we don't fully understand. And I've seen enough sunsets over those hills to think there might be something to it. The conversation flowed easily between them as the miles passed. Grace learned that Dan had been in North Platte for 5 years, that he was head wrangler at the Wilson Ranch, and that he had a talent for breaking even the most stubborn horses. In turn, she shared small pieces of herself, her love of creating beautiful hats, her hope to build something lasting in North Platte, her parents' deaths 3 years prior. What she didn't share were the darker parts. The powerful businessman whose unwanted advances had turned to threats when rejected, the whispers that had followed her, the night she'd finally decided that leaving was her only option. Those stories weren't meant for the bright Nebraska afternoon or for a man she'd just met, no matter how kind his eyes. As they approached North Platte, the landscape gradually changed. Isolated homesteads appeared, then clustered buildings, until finally the town itself came into view. It wasn't large, nothing like Chicago, but Grace could see the vitality in its wide main street, the solid brick buildings interspersed with wooden structures, the busy railroad station that was the town's lifeblood. There she is, Dan said, a note of pride in his voice. Not much compared to Chicago, I imagine. It's perfect, Grace replied softly, meaning it. This place represented freedom, possibility, a chance to define herself on her own terms. Dan guided her to the livery stable, introducing her to Henry, a grizzled older man who inspected the broken axle with expert eyes. Decent field repair, he commented, glancing at Dan. Your work, Baxter? Yes, sir, Dan nodded. Well, it got her here. I can have it properly fixed by tomorrow afternoon, Henry said to Grace. Cost you $3 for parts and labor. That's fair, Grace agreed, relieved the price wasn't higher. Is there somewhere I can stay in the meantime, a hotel or boarding house, Mrs.? Peterson runs a respectable boarding house just 2 streets over, Dan suggested. I can show you if you'd like, Grace nodded gratefully. That would be helpful. They left her wagon and team in Henry's care, with Grace taking only a small valise containing her most important possessions, including the deed to her shop. As they walked through town, Dan pointed out various establishments. The general store, the bank, the post office, and finally, the millinery shop that would soon be hers. Grace stopped in front of the simple storefront with its large display window, currently empty of merchandise. The sign above simply read "Millinery" in faded paint. Through the dusty glass, she could make out display stands and a counter, waiting to be brought back to life. It needs work, she admitted, but I can see the potential. Like most things worth having, Dan agreed quietly. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the recognition of kindred spirits. 2 people who had left their pasts behind to build something new. The moment was interrupted by a booming voice. Baxter. Thought you were heading back to the ranch hours ago. They turned to see a tall man approaching, the silver star on his vest identifying him as the sheriff Dan had mentioned earlier. Sheriff Miller, Dan greeted him. Got sidetracked helping Miss Keller here with a broken wagon axle. Miss Keller, this is Sheriff James Miller. Madam, the sheriff nodded respectfully. Welcome to North Platte. Thank you, Sheriff, Grace replied. I'm looking forward to becoming part of the community. I'll be reopening the millinery shop. That's good news, Miller said. Town's been needing a proper hat shop since Eliza Wilson passed. You planning to open soon? As soon as I can get settled and receive my inventory, Grace confirmed. Perhaps 2 weeks. Well, you let me know if you need anything, the sheriff offered. He turned to Dan. Wilson was in town earlier looking for you. Something about those new horses from Kentucky. Dan nodded. I'll head back now, just helping Miss Keller find Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. I can take her from here if you need to get going, Miller offered. Grace felt a surprising pang of disappointment at the thought of parting from Dan so soon. He'd been a reassuring presence in a day filled with uncertainty. Dan glanced at her, seeming to hesitate. If you don't mind, Sheriff, I'd like to see Miss Keller safely settled. Miller's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Suit yourself, Miss Keller, welcome again to North Platte. As the sheriff continued on his rounds, Dan and Grace resumed their walk toward the boarding house. You didn't have to delay your return on my account, Grace said, though she was secretly pleased he had chosen to stay. Wilson can wait another hour, Dan replied. Those horses aren't going anywhere. The boarding house was a tidy 2-story building with white curtains in the windows and flowers growing in boxes along the porch. Mrs. Peterson, a plump woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun, greeted them at the door. Daniel Baxter, as I live and breathe, she exclaimed. Haven't seen you in town for an age. Been busy at the ranch, Mrs. Peterson, Dan said with a smile. This is Miss Grace Keller. She's new to town and needs a room while she gets her millinery shop set up. Mrs. Peterson's face brightened. A milliner, how wonderful. We've been desperate for quality hats since poor Eliza passed. She turned to Grace with a welcoming smile. I have a lovely room on the 2nd floor, dear. $5 a week includes breakfast and supper. That would be perfect, Grace agreed, relieved at the reasonable rate, as Mrs. Peterson bustled off to prepare the room. Dan and Grace were left alone in the small parlor. An awkward silence fell between them, as if both suddenly realized their brief acquaintance was coming to an end. Thank you again for all your help today, Grace said finally. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. You'd have figured something out, Dan replied with conviction. You strike me as a woman who finds a way through difficulties. Grace smiled, touched by his faith in her capabilities. Still, I'm grateful our paths crossed. Dan nodded, looking down at his hat, which he held in his hands. Miss Keller, Grace, he began, then paused, seeming to gather his courage. I know you're just arriving and have much to do, but perhaps once you're settled. That is, would you allow me to call on you properly sometime? The question surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. There had been something building between them throughout the day, a connection, a sense of ease she hadn't expected to find with a stranger. I would like that, she answered honestly. His face brightened. Maybe I could show you around the area. There's a lot of beautiful country beyond the town limits. I'd enjoy that, Grace said, finding that she truly meant it. Mrs. Peterson returned then, announcing the room was ready. Dan took this as his cue to leave, placing his hat back on his head. I'll check in on your wagon tomorrow, make sure Henry's taking good care of it, he promised. You don't need to do that, Grace protested. I want to, he replied simply. Besides, it gives me an excuse to see you again. The straightforward admission made her cheeks warm. It had been a long time since anyone had sought her company for the simple pleasure of it. Dan tipped his hat. Until tomorrow, Miss Keller. As Grace watched him walk away through the boarding house window, she felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years' hope, not just for her new business and life in North Platte, but for possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider since leaving Chicago. Mrs. Peterson appeared at her elbow with a knowing smile. Daniel Baxter is one of the good ones, she said. Not like some of these frontier men. His mother raised him right before she passed, God rest her soul. We've only just met, Grace felt compelled to point out. He was simply helping a stranger in need. The older woman chuckled. I've known that boy for 5 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you just now." She patted Grace's arm. "Come along, dear, let me show you to your room. You must be exhausted after your journey." As Grace followed Mrs. Peterson up the stairs, she couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. For the first time in a long while, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow with genuine anticipation. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the lace curtains of Grace's room at the boarding house. She woke feeling more rested than she had in weeks, despite the unfamiliar bed. After washing her face in the basin provided, she dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, a modest blue calico with white trim, and pinned her chestnut hair into a simple but neat arrangement. She told herself the extra care was merely because she would be meeting with the bank manager and visiting her new shop, not because Dan Baxter had promised to check on her wagon. Still, she couldn't deny the small thrill of anticipation she felt at the prospect of seeing him again. Breakfast at Mrs. Peterson's was a hearty affair of flapjacks, bacon, and strong coffee, shared with the boarding house's 3 other residents. A young schoolteacher named Miss Wallace, an elderly widower who introduced himself as Mr. Collins, and a railroad clerk called Timothy Morris. All 3 welcomed Grace warmly, eager for news from the East and details about her plans for the millinery shop. "We've been ordering our hats from catalogs since Mrs. Wilson passed," Miss Wallace explained, stirring sugar into her coffee. "It will be wonderful to have someone local again." "Do you make men's hats as well?" Mr. Collins inquired hopefully. Grace smiled. "I do indeed. My father wore only hats I made for him in his final years." "Your father taught you the trade?" Mrs. Peterson asked, refilling coffee cups. "No," Grace replied, a shadow crossing her face briefly. "I apprenticed with Madame Laurent in Chicago from the age of 16. My father was a bookkeeper." She didn't elaborate on how she'd sought the apprenticeship after her mother's death, needing to help support the household as her father's health began to fail. How she discovered not only an aptitude for the work, but a genuine love for the artistry of millinery, the transformative power of a well-crafted hat. After breakfast, Grace set out to begin the business of establishing herself in North Platte. Her first stop was the bank, where she presented her letter of introduction from her Chicago bank to Mr. Howard, the manager. He was a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, who examined her papers with careful scrutiny. "Everything appears to be in order, Miss Keller," he said finally. "Your funds have been transferred successfully. The balance is as you expected." He slid a slip of paper across his desk, showing a figure that represented nearly all her worldly wealth, the proceeds from selling her parents' house and belongings, minus what she'd spent on the journey and the purchase of the millinery shop. It would be enough to restart the business, but not by much. She would need to begin earning income quickly. "Thank you, Mr. Howard," Grace said, tucking the paper into her reticule. "I'll need to make a small withdrawal today for supplies and to pay the livery." With her banking business concluded, Grace made her way to the general store, where she purchased cleaning supplies and a few necessities for her new shop. The store owner, Mr. Pearson, was effusive in his welcome. "A hat shop is just what this town needs," he declared, wrapping her purchases in brown paper. "My wife's been complaining for months about having to send away for her bonnets, says half the time they arrive crushed beyond repair." "I hope to solve that problem," Grace assured him. "Once I'm established, I'll be able to offer both ready-made hats and custom designs." Laden with her purchases, Grace headed toward the livery stable to check on her wagon. As she approached, she spotted a familiar figure examining the repair work on her axle. Dan had kept his promise. He looked up at her approach, his face brightening. "Miss Keller," he greeted her, touching the brim of his hat, "was just making sure Henry's taking good care of your wagon." "And is he?" Grace asked, setting her packages down. "Doing a fine job," Dan confirmed. "Should be ready by this afternoon, just as he promised." "Thank you for checking," Grace said, "though you didn't need to take time away from your work." "I was in town anyway," Dan replied. "Wilson sent me to pick up some supplies." He gestured to several crates loaded on a wagon nearby. Grace nodded, oddly pleased that his presence wasn't solely on her account. She didn't want to feel beholden to this man she barely knew, no matter how kind he'd been. "I've been busy myself," she said, indicating her packages. "Getting supplies to clean up the shop. Need any help with that?" Dan offered. "I've got an hour before I need to head back to the ranch." Grace hesitated. The offer was tempting. The shop would need a thorough cleaning, and an extra pair of hands would make the work go faster. Still, she was conscious of propriety. A single woman accepting help from a man she'd just met might raise eyebrows, even in a frontier town. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose," she began. "Not an imposition at all," Dan insisted. "Besides, in a small town like this, neighbors help neighbors. It's how we all get by." Put that way, his offer seemed less fraught with complication. "In that case, I'd appreciate the assistance," Grace agreed. "The shop's just down the street." Together they walked to the millinery shop, Grace noticing how several townspeople nodded to Dan or called greetings as they passed. He clearly was well regarded in North Platte. The shop, when Grace unlocked it with the key she'd received from the bank, was exactly as she'd glimpsed through the window, dusty but fundamentally sound. A counter ran along the back wall, and several display stands waited for hats. A doorway led to a back room that would serve as her workroom, and a small staircase indicated living quarters above. "It's perfect," Grace breathed, already envisioning how it would look once cleaned and stocked with her creations. "Needs work," Dan observed, running a finger through the dust on a shelf, "but I can see why you're excited." Grace set her packages on the counter and began unpacking the cleaning supplies. "Mrs. Wilson must have been gone for some time before she passed. The dust is considerable." "She fell ill about a year ago," Dan explained, rolling up his sleeves. "Went to stay with her daughter in Omaha for treatment, but never recovered enough to return." Grace felt a pang of sadness for the woman she'd never met but whose legacy she was inheriting. "I hope I can do justice to what she built here." "I'm sure you will," Dan said, his confidence warming her. "Where should we start?" For the next hour they worked side by side, sweeping, dusting, and scrubbing. Grace was impressed by Dan's willingness to tackle even the dirtiest tasks without complaint. He moved furniture so she could clean underneath, reached the high shelves she couldn't, and even volunteered to wash the front window. As they worked, they talked about the town, about Grace's journey west, about Dan's life on the Wilson ranch. Grace found herself relaxing in his company, sharing small stories from her childhood in Chicago that she hadn't spoken of in years. "My father used to take me to Lake Michigan on summer evenings," she recalled, polishing the counter to a shine. "We'd watch the boats and he'd buy me a candy stick. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed that until just now." Dan smiled, a wistful look crossing his face. "Sounds nice." "My pa wasn't much for spending time with us kids. When he wasn't working, he was usually at the saloon." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, as if he hadn't meant to reveal something so personal. "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. Dan shrugged, turning back to the window he was cleaning. "It was a long time ago. My mom made up for it anyway, taught us right from wrong, made sure we had what we needed." "Us?" Grace inquired gently. "Me and my brother Caleb," Dan answered. "He's back in Missouri. Took over the family farm after Pa passed." Grace sensed there was more to that story but didn't press. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep private. She certainly did. "This place is already looking better," she said instead, changing the subject. "I can't thank you enough for your help." "Happy to do it," Dan replied, finishing the window with a final wipe. "What's next on your list?" Grace glanced around the much-improved shop. "I think we've done the major cleaning for today. My next task is to inventory what supplies Mrs. Wilson left behind in the workroom, then make a list of what I'll need to order." Dan nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I should be getting back to the ranch soon anyway. Wilson's expecting these supplies." A fleeting disappointment passed through Grace, quickly dismissed. "Of course he had his own responsibilities." "Of course," she said. "Thank you again for all your help." Dan hesitated, then spoke as if making up his mind about something. "The town's holding a social on Saturday evening. Dance at the town hall, food, music. It's a monthly tradition. Would you?" "That is, might you consider attending with me?" The invitation caught Grace by surprise. A social meant being seen together publicly, a more formal statement of interest than his casual offer to call on her. "I don't know if I should," she said hesitantly. "I've only just arrived and there's so much to do with the shop." "It would be a good way to meet folks," Dan suggested. "Make connections that might help your business." He had a point. Success in a small town depended partly on becoming part of the community. Still, the prospect of attending a social with a man she barely knew in a town where she was a stranger. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Thank you for the invitation." Dan nodded, accepting her noncommittal answer with good grace. "Fair enough." "Your wagon should be ready by 4 o'clock, according to Henry. Do you want me to bring it around to the shop for you?" "That's not necessary," Grace began. "It's no trouble," Dan insisted. "I'll be heading back to town anyway to deliver some paperwork for Wilson." His persistence was both charming and slightly overwhelming. Grace wasn't accustomed to someone being so consistently helpful without expecting something in return. In her experience, men who offered assistance usually wanted more than gratitude. But something in Dan's open expression, the way he maintained a respectful distance even as he offered his help, made her inclined to trust him. "All right," she agreed. "Thank you, I'll be here at the shop." Dan smiled, retrieving his hat from where he'd hung it on a peg. "Until later then, Miss Keller." After he left, Grace stood in the center of the newly cleaned shop, trying to sort through her conflicting emotions. She'd come to North Platte to start fresh, to build a business and a life free from the complications and disappointments of her past. The last thing she'd expected was to find herself drawn to a man on her very first day in town. Daniel Baxter was undeniably appealing, handsome, kind, respectful. But Grace had learned the hard way that men weren't always what they seemed, and allowing herself to develop feelings before she was established here could be a dangerous distraction. "Focus on the shop," she told herself firmly. "That's what matters now." With renewed determination, Grace turned her attention to the workroom. Mrs. Wilson had left behind some basic supplies: spools of ribbon, bolts of fabric, wireframes for hat structures, all of which would be useful. Grace made careful notes of what was available and what she would need to order. By mid-afternoon, she had a comprehensive inventory and a list of supplies to be ordered from Omaha and Chicago. She also had a clearer vision for how to arrange the shop and what styles to feature in her initial offerings. The work absorbed her completely, allowing her to push thoughts of Dan Baxter to the back of her mind. At precisely 4 o'clock, she heard the sound of a wagon pulling up outside. Looking through the newly cleaned front window, she saw Dan climbing down from the driver's seat of her wagon, the team looking well-rested and fed. Grace grabbed her reticule and locked the shop behind her as she stepped outside. "Right on time," she greeted him. "Henry finished a bit early," Dan explained. "Said the old axle was more worn than he thought. Put in a completely new one rather than just repairing it. No extra charge." "That's very generous of him," Grace said, surprised at such treatment. "He's fair," Dan agreed. "And I may have mentioned you were opening a business in town. We all try to help newcomers get established, especially those bringing needed services." Grace approached the wagon, examining the new axle. "It looks sturdy. Please thank Henry for me when you see him next." "You can thank him yourself," Dan suggested. "His wife will be one of your first customers, I guarantee it. She's always complaining about having to trim her own hats since Mrs. Wilson closed up shop." The mention of potential customers brought Grace's focus back to her business plans. "I hope to open within 2 weeks if I can get my supply orders filled quickly." "The train makes that easier these days," Dan said. "Used to take months to get anything out here." Grace nodded, then reached for her purse. "What do I owe Henry for the repair?" $3, as he quoted," Dan answered. Grace counted out the money. "And what do I owe you for bringing the wagon around?" Dan shook his head. "Nothing at all. It was on my way." "You've been extraordinarily kind to a stranger, Mr. Baxter," Grace said. "I'm not sure how to properly thank you." A hint of color rose in Dan's cheeks. "You could start by calling me Dan like I asked yesterday." Grace smiled despite herself. "Very well, Dan. And perhaps you might reconsider attending the social on Saturday," he added hopefully. No pressure, of course, but it would be a pleasure to introduce you to more of the town. Looking at his earnest expression, Grace found her resolve weakening. There was no harm in attending a public gathering after all. And he was right that it would be a good opportunity to meet potential customers. I think I would like that, she said finally. Thank you for the invitation. Dan's face brightened. Wonderful. I can collect you from Mrs. Peterson's at 7 if that suits you. That would be fine, Grace agreed. As Dan prepared to leave, mounting his own horse which had been tethered to the back of her wagon, Grace found herself wishing their conversation could continue. It was a surprising realization for someone who had deliberately chosen solitude for so long. Will I see you before Saturday? The question slipped out before she could consider its implications. Dan looked pleased by her inquiry. I expect to be in town tomorrow or the day after. Wilson's sending me to meet with the banker about those Kentucky horses I mentioned. I could stop by the shop, see how you're getting on. I'd like that, Grace admitted. With a tip of his hat and a warm smile, Dan rode off toward the Wilson ranch. Grace watched him go, a mixture of anticipation and caution warring within her. Be careful, Grace, she murmured to herself as she climbed onto the wagon seat. Remember why you came here. But as she guided her team toward the boarding house, she couldn't help wondering if perhaps North Platte might offer more than just a fresh start for her business. Perhaps it might also heal the parts of her heart she'd closed off long ago. The next few days passed in a blur of activity for Grace. She threw herself into preparing the shop, arranging and rearranging displays, cleaning the upstairs living quarters, and writing letters to her suppliers in Chicago and Omaha with detailed orders. She also began work on a few sample hats using the materials Mrs. Wilson had left behind, wanting to have something to show potential customers even before her full inventory arrived. True to his word, Dan stopped by the shop on Thursday afternoon. Grace was balanced on a stepladder, hanging curtains in the front window when the bell over the door jingled. Need a taller assistant, Dan called up to her, his smile warm as he removed his hat. Grace returned his smile, surprised by how pleased she was to see him. I'm managing, but thank you. She finished securing the curtain rod and descended the ladder carefully, brushing dust from her apron. She dressed simply today in a practical brown skirt and white shirtwaist, her hair tied back with a ribbon. Next to Dan's clean shirt and brushed jacket, she felt suddenly conscious of her workday appearance. The place is really coming along, Dan observed, looking around at the transformed shop. The counters gleamed with polish, the display stands were arranged artfully, and the windows now let in abundant light through fresh curtains. Thank you, Grace said. I've been working from dawn till dusk, but it's worth the effort. You've certainly put your stamp on it already, Dan said. It's hardly recognizable as Mrs. Wilson's old place. Grace led him toward the counter where she'd set out the 3 hats she'd completed so far: a simple straw bonnet with blue ribbon, a more elaborate lady's hat with silk flowers, and a practical men's bowler. What do you think? She asked, suddenly nervous about his opinion. I'm limited by the materials I have on hand, but once my orders arrive. Dan studied the hats with genuine interest. They're fine work, he said, especially this one. He pointed to the lady's hat with the flowers. Reminds me of something my mother would have saved up to wear to church on Easter Sunday. The comment touched Grace. That's exactly the market I'm aiming for: special occasion hats that make a woman feel beautiful but still practical enough for frontier life. Dan nodded his approval. You understand the town already. He gestured toward the men's bowler. And this one, you make men's hats too? I do, Grace confirmed. Though I prefer the artistry of ladies' hats, there's a satisfaction in crafting a proper bowler or Stetson as well. Dan picked up the bowler, turning it in his hands. It's quality work, better than what most men around here wear. Would you like to try it on? Grace offered. Dan looked surprised. I don't want to spoil it. Nonsense, hats are meant to be worn. With a slightly self-conscious smile, Dan placed the bowler on his head. It suited him, Grace thought, giving him a distinguished air that complemented his strong features. How does it look? He asked. Very handsome, Grace replied truthfully. then felt heat rise in her cheeks at the directness of her compliment. Dan's eyes met hers, a flicker of something passing between them, awareness, perhaps, or recognition of the growing connection neither had expected to find. He removed the hat carefully, placing it back on the display stand. "I might have to commission one for myself once you're properly open for business." "I'd be happy to make one specially for you," Grace said. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Dan cleared his throat. "I stopped by to confirm our arrangements for Saturday. Is 7 o'clock still agreeable?" "Yes," Grace replied. "I'll be ready." "The social is nothing fancy," Dan added. "Just folks gathering for music and dancing, some food. Ladies usually wear their Sunday best, but nothing too elaborate." "I understand," Grace assured him. "I have a suitable dress." In truth, she had been pondering what to wear since accepting his invitation. The pale green silk she'd brought from Chicago might be too formal for a frontier town gathering, but the simpler blue cotton perhaps too plain for an evening event. She'd finally settled on a compromise, a rose-colored poplin with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. "I should let you get back to your work," Dan said, reaching for his hat. "I just wanted to make sure you were still planning to attend." "I am," Grace confirmed. "I'm looking forward to it." The admission was honest. Despite her initial reservations, she found herself genuinely anticipating the social, both as an opportunity to meet more townspeople and as a chance to spend more time with Dan. "As am I," Dan said, his expression warm. "Until Saturday, then." After he left, Grace returned to her work, but found her thoughts repeatedly straying to the upcoming social. It had been years since she'd attended such an event, not since before her parents' deaths. The idea of dancing, of allowing herself simple pleasures like music and conversation, felt almost foreign after so long focused solely on survival and building her business. Yet there was something about Dan Baxter that made her want to rediscover those joys. His straightforward kindness, his respect for her independence, his lack of pretension, all were qualities she hadn't expected to find in a man she met by chance on the prairie. Saturday arrived clear and pleasantly warm for early autumn. Grace spent the morning working in the shop, then returned to the boarding house early to prepare for the evening. After bathing with the hot water Mrs. Peterson provided, she dressed carefully in the rose poplin, arranging her hair in a more elaborate style than her usual practical knot. As she secured the final hairpin, she studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. At 22, she was no longer the carefree girl who had once attended dances in Chicago, but neither was she the haunted woman who had fled the city 3 weeks ago. There was color in her cheeks and a brightness in her eyes that had been absent for too long. "You look lovely, my dear," Mrs. Peterson declared when Grace descended to the parlor. "That shade suits you perfectly." "Thank you," Grace replied, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Daniel is a fortunate man to be escorting such a pretty young lady," the older woman continued with a knowing smile. "It's just a social gathering," Grace protested mildly. "Mr. Baxter is being kind to a newcomer, that's all, Mrs. Peterson's expression made it clear she didn't believe this explanation for a moment, but she merely patted Grace's arm. "Of course, dear. All the same, I haven't seen him attend one of these socials with a young lady before, not in all the years he's been in North Platte." Before Grace could respond to this intriguing information, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Peterson hurried to answer it, greeting Dan with obvious approval of his appearance, and indeed, Grace had to admit he cut a fine figure. He wore a clean, dark suit that, while not new or fashionable by Chicago standards, fit him well and showed he'd made an effort. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and in his hand he held a small posy of prairie wildflowers. "Miss Keller," he greeted her, his admiration evident in his gaze. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Grace replied, feeling unaccountably shy. "You're very handsome yourself." Dan's smile widened at her compliment. He extended the wildflowers. "These aren't much compared to what you probably had in Chicago, but they reminded me of your dress when I spotted them this morning." Grace accepted the simple bouquet, touched by the thoughtful gesture. The flowers were indeed a similar shade to her dress, delicate pink blooms mixed with sprigs of prairie grass. "They're perfect," she said sincerely. "Let me put them in water before we go." Mrs. Peterson bustled forward. "I'll take care of that, dear. You two run along and enjoy yourselves." With the landlady's blessing, Dan offered Grace his arm, and they set off toward the town hall. The evening air was mild, the sky painted in spectacular shades of gold and pink as the sun set behind the distant hills. Other couples and families were walking in the same direction, and several people called greetings to Dan or nodded curiously at Grace. "Word's gotten around that the new milliner has arrived," Dan explained as they walked. "Folks are eager to meet you." "I hope I make a good impression," Grace said. "You will," Dan assured her. "Just be yourself." The town hall was a substantial wooden building near the center of North Platte. As they approached, Grace could hear fiddle music spilling out into the evening air, along with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Lanterns hung from posts around the entrance, casting a warm glow over arriving guests. Inside, the main room had been transformed for the occasion. Benches and chairs lined the walls, leaving a large open space in the center for dancing. At the far end, tables held an array of food and drink contributed by the townspeople. A small group of musicians played on a raised platform, two fiddlers, a man with a guitar and another with a harmonica. "It's wonderful," Grace said, taking in the festive scene. People of all ages filled the room, families with children, elderly couples, young men and women clearly hoping to catch each other's eye. "It's not exactly a Chicago ballroom," Dan said with a hint of self-consciousness. "It's better," Grace replied honestly. "There's real joy here." Dan's expression warmed at her response. "Let me introduce you to some folks." For the next half hour, Grace met what seemed like half the town: the mayor and his wife, the school teacher she'd already encountered at the boarding house, storekeepers, ranchers, and their families. Everyone welcomed her warmly, many expressing delight at the prospect of a millinery shop reopening in town. "You'll be busy from dawn till dusk once word gets out," predicted Mrs. Wilson, the wife of Dan's employer. She was a kindly woman in her 50s with a practical manner. "I've been trimming my own hats for a year now, and I'm sorry to say I have no talent for it." "I'll be happy to help," Grace assured her. "I hope to open within 2 weeks once my supplies arrive. You must come to Sunday dinner at the ranch when you're settled," Mrs. Wilson insisted. "We'd love to have you, wouldn't we, Thomas?" Her husband, a tall man with a weathered face and shrewd eyes, nodded his agreement. "Any friend of Baxter's is welcome at our table." He gave Dan a look that Grace couldn't quite interpret, somewhere between approval and warning. As they moved away from the Wilsons, Dan leaned closer to Grace. "That's high praise from Thomas Wilson. He doesn't extend invitations lightly." "They seem like good people," Grace observed. "The best," Dan agreed. "Gave me a chance when I first came to North Platte, not much more than a drifter with some skill with horses. They've been like family to me." The music shifted to a livelier tune, and several couples moved to the center of the room to dance. Dan turned to Grace with a questioning look. "Would you care to dance, Miss Keller?" he asked formally, though his eyes held a teasing light. Grace hesitated. It had been so long since she danced. "I might be a bit rusty," she admitted. "That makes 2 of us," Dan replied with a grin. "But I promise not to step on your toes if you'll extend me the same courtesy." His easy manner dispelled her nervousness. "In that case, I accept." Dan led her to the dance floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while taking her hand with the other. The touch, even through layers of fabric, sent a small thrill through Grace. As they began to move to the music, she was relieved to find that her body remembered the steps better than she'd feared. Dan proved to be a capable, if not polished, dancer. He moved with the natural grace of a man accustomed to physical work, guiding her through the figures of the country dance with confidence. "You dance well for a cowboy," Grace teased as they circled each other. "And you dance beautifully for a milliner," he returned, his eyes never leaving hers. They danced 3 consecutive dances, each bringing them closer together, breaking down the careful distance they'd maintained. By the third dance, a slower waltz, Grace was acutely aware of Dan's hand at her waist, the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him, the warmth in his blue eyes when he looked at her. When the music ended, they both seemed reluctant to part. "Would you like some refreshment?" Dan asked, his voice slightly husky. "Yes, please," Grace replied, suddenly aware of how warm the room had become. Dan guided her toward the refreshment table, where he procured 2 cups of punch. They found a relatively quiet corner where they could talk while observing the continuing festivities. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Dan asked. "Very much," Grace assured him. "Everyone has been so welcoming." "North Platte tends to embrace newcomers," Dan said, "especially beautiful, talented ones who fill a need in the community." The compliment brought color to Grace's cheeks. "You're very kind." "Not kind, honest." Dan's gaze was direct, making it impossible to doubt his sincerity. "You're going to be a success here, Grace. I can feel it." The use of her given name, without the formality of Miss Keller, felt intimate in a way that should have alarmed her but instead sent a pleasant warmth through her chest. "I hope you're right," she said. "I've invested everything in this new beginning." "May I ask what brought you all the way from Chicago?" Dan inquired gently. "It's a long journey for anyone, especially a woman alone." Grace tensed slightly. She'd been avoiding this question, not ready to share the darker aspects of her past. But something about Dan's open expression, the genuine interest in his eyes, made her want to offer at least a partial truth. "After my parents died, there was little keeping me in Chicago," she began carefully. "I had my skills as a milliner, but the city, it held too many painful memories. When I saw the advertisement for Mrs. Wilson's shop, it seemed like a sign, a chance to build something of my own, somewhere new." Dan nodded, seeming to understand there was more to the story than she was sharing. "Sometimes a fresh start is the greatest gift we can give ourselves," he said. "What about you?" Grace asked, turning the conversation away from herself. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned you came to North Platte 5 years ago. What brought you west from Missouri?" A shadow crossed Dan's face. "The war changed things, changed me. After I came home, the farm felt confining. My brother was better suited to taking it over anyway. I needed open spaces, room to breathe." "And you found that here?" "I found more than I expected," Dan replied. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "North Platte gave me purpose again, good people who became like family. Now I'm wondering if it might offer even more than I dared hope for." The implication hung in the air between them, a possibility, a future neither had anticipated when they met on that dusty trail just days ago. Before Grace could formulate a response, they were interrupted by Sheriff Miller, who approached with a friendly nod. "Miss Keller, good to see you again," he greeted her. "Settling in well?" "Very well, thank you, Sheriff," Grace replied, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. "Everyone has been most welcoming." "Glad to hear it." Miller turned to Dan. "Baxter, Wilson mentioned you might be making a trip to Omaha next week for those Kentucky horses." Dan nodded. "Leaving Tuesday if all goes according to plan, should be back by Friday or Saturday." Grace felt an unexpected pang at the news. The idea of Dan being away, even for a few days, shouldn't have affected her so strongly. Yet she found herself already calculating the days until his return. "Well, be careful on the road," Miller advised. Had reports of some trouble near the Platte crossing, nothing specific, just travelers feeling uneasy. He tipped his hat to Grace. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Miss Keller. Baxter, don't step on the ladies' toes out there." After the sheriff moved on, Dan turned back to Grace with an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that. Official business follows some of us everywhere." "It's quite all right," Grace assured him. "I didn't realize you were leaving town so soon." "Just for a few days," Dan said. "Wilson's investing in some fine Kentucky stock for breeding. Wants me to personally escort them back from Omaha." "It sounds like an important responsibility," Grace observed. "It is," Dan agreed. "Wilson trusts me with his best horses." He hesitated, then added, "I'd planned to tell you about the trip. I was hoping. That is, I wondered if you might permit me to call on you when I return, properly, I mean." The formal request took Grace by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Their connection had been building steadily since their chance meeting. each interaction deepening her impression of Dan as a man of integrity and kindness. "I would like that," she said softly. Dan's expression brightened. "Maybe I could take you on that ride I mentioned. Show you some of the country around North Platte." "I'd enjoy that," Grace agreed, finding she truly meant it. The music started again, a lively reel that had couples rushing to the dance floor. Dan extended his hand. "One more dance before we call it an evening." Grace placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her back to the dance floor. As they joined the whirling couples, she found herself laughing with genuine joy for the first time in longer than she could remember. Dan's smile, the warmth of his hand holding hers, the music surrounding them all combined to create a moment of perfect happiness she hadn't expected to find in this frontier town. Perhaps, Grace thought as they danced, North Platte would offer her not just a new beginning for her business, but a chance to rediscover parts of herself she'd thought lost forever, her capacity for joy, for trust, for connection. And perhaps Daniel Baxter would be part of that discovery. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Grace awoke early, her mind still filled with memories of the previous evening, the music, the dancing, the warmth in Dan's eyes when he looked at her. He had escorted her back to the boarding house after the social, their conversation flowing easily as they walked under the star-filled prairie sky. At the door, he had taken her hand, pressing it briefly to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and unexpectedly moving. "I'll come by before I leave for Omaha," he'd promised, "to say a proper goodbye." Now, as Grace dressed for the day, she found herself looking forward to that visit with an anticipation that both excited and unnerved her. It had been years since she'd allowed herself to feel this way about anyone, this mixture of eagerness and possibility, of wanting to know everything about another person. After breakfast, Grace headed to her shop, determined to make progress on her preparations despite her distracted thoughts. The morning passed quickly as she worked on the upstairs living quarters, making the small apartment habitable. She planned to move from Mrs. Peterson's within the week, eager to establish her own household above the shop, as Mrs. Wilson had done before her. Shortly after noon, the bell above the shop door jingled. Grace, who had been sweeping the upstairs floor, hurried down to find Dan standing in the middle of her shop, hat in hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," Grace assured him, brushing dust from her apron. "I was just cleaning the upstairs rooms." "Planning to move in soon?" Dan asked. Grace nodded. "By the end of the week, I hope. Mrs. Peterson has been wonderfully kind, but I'm eager to have my own space again." "Understandable," Dan said. He seemed slightly nervous, shifting his hat between his hands. "I know I said I'd come by before leaving for Omaha, but Wilson's pushed up our departure. We're leaving at first light tomorrow." "Oh," Grace said, surprised by the strength of her disappointment. "That's sooner than expected." "It is," Dan agreed. "There's a storm front moving in later this week, and Wilson wants us back before it hits." He hesitated, then added, "I was hoping you might join me for dinner this evening. Nothing fancy, just the hotel dining room, but I'd like to spend some time with you before I go." The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I'd like that," Grace said. "What time?" 6 o'clock. I can collect you from Mrs. Peterson's." 6 would be perfect, Grace confirmed. Dan's smile brightened his entire face. "Excellent. I should let you get back to your work. I have preparations of my own to make before tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Grace found herself reluctant to see him go. "Dan," she called after him. When he paused, looking back at her with those clear blue eyes, she continued, "Be careful on the road." "The sheriff mentioned there might be trouble." "I always am," he assured her with a gentle smile, "but I appreciate your concern." After he left, Grace returned to her cleaning, but her thoughts remained with Dan. She was developing feelings for him, that much was undeniable. The question was whether she should allow those feelings to grow. Her last experience with romantic attachment had ended painfully. Charles Blackwood had been everything a young woman might want in a suitor: handsome, wealthy, well-connected in Chicago society. He'd courted her with flowers and compliments, with theater tickets and carriage rides along the lakeshore. She'd been dazzled, believing his declarations of love and respect. But when she'd refused his advances before marriage, his charm had given way to something darker. His persistence had turned to pressure, his flattery to manipulation. And when she'd broken their engagement, his true nature had revealed itself in threats and public humiliation, using his influence to damage her reputation and her family's standing. It was his final threat whispered to her at her father's funeral that had ultimately driven her to leave Chicago altogether. "You'll be mine, Grace, one way or another. A woman alone can't stand against me forever." The memory still chilled her. She'd fled west partly to escape Charles, partly to rebuild a life untainted by his malice. The last thing she'd expected was to find herself drawn to another man so soon after arriving in North Platte. Yet Dan Baxter was nothing like Charles Blackwood. Where Charles had been polished and urbane, Dan was straightforward and unpretentious. Where Charles had pressed his advantage at every opportunity, Dan maintained a respectful distance even as his interest was clear. Where Charles had viewed her independence as an inconvenience to be overcome, Dan seemed to admire her strength and determination. Still, Grace had learned the hard way that people weren't always what they seemed. Caution was warranted, especially when her heart was involved. As evening approached, Grace returned to the boarding house to prepare for dinner. She chose a simple but becoming dress of deep blue, arranging her hair with care. Mrs. Peterson, noticing her preparations, offered a knowing smile but refrained from comment, for which Grace was grateful. Dan arrived precisely at 6, freshly shaved and dressed in clean clothes, though not the formal suit he'd worn to the social. He greeted her with obvious appreciation of her appearance. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thank you," Grace replied. "You're quite handsome yourself." The hotel dining room was the most refined establishment in North Platte, though it would have been considered merely adequate in Chicago. Still, the tablecloths were clean, the silverware polished, and the menu offered more variety than Grace had expected. As they settled at their table, Grace noticed several curious glances from other diners. Clearly, her dinner with Dan was noteworthy in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. "People are watching us," she murmured to Dan. He smiled ruefully. Small-town curiosity. "The new milliner dining with Wilson's ranch foreman is bound to cause some talk." "Does that bother you?" Grace asked. "Not if it doesn't bother you," Dan replied. "Though I should warn you by tomorrow, half the town will have decided we're courting, and the other half will be taking bets on when we'll announce an engagement." The comment was clearly meant as a jest, but it sent a flutter of nerves through Grace's stomach. "That seems rather premature," she said lightly. Dan's expression turned more serious. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. People will talk regardless of what we do or don't do. It's the nature of small towns." "I understand," Grace assured him. I'm still establishing myself here. My business needs to be my priority." "Of course," Dan agreed readily. "I respect that completely." The waiter arrived then to take their orders: roast beef for Dan, chicken for Grace, providing a welcome change of subject. As they waited for their meals, their conversation turned to more neutral topics: Dan's upcoming journey to Omaha, Grace's plans for the shop, the changing weather patterns as autumn approached. By the time their food arrived, Grace found herself relaxing again, enjoying Dan's company without the weight of expectations. He told her stories of his early days at the Wilson Ranch, including a particularly humorous account of his first attempt to break a stubborn Mustang. "Ended up face first in the mud," he concluded with a self-deprecating laugh. Wilson said it was the most entertainment he'd had in months. Grace laughed, imagining the scene. "Did you ever manage to break the horse?" "Eventually," Dan said. "He's still at the ranch ornery as ever, but we came to an understanding. I respect his spirit. He tolerates my presence on his back." "Sounds like a fair arrangement," Grace observed. "Most good relationships are about finding that balance," Dan replied. His eyes met hers across the table, and for a moment, the conversation seemed to be about more than just horses. Their meal concluded with apple pie and coffee, both surprisingly good. As they lingered over the dessert, Dan reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of touching hers. "I've enjoyed getting to know you these past few days, Grace," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I know you need to focus on your business, and I respect that, but I hope you'll allow me to call on you when I return from Omaha." The earnestness in his expression touched Grace. There was no pressure in his words, only honest interest and respect for her priorities. "I'd like that, Dan," she replied softly. His smile warmed her more than the coffee ever could. "Then I'll have something to look forward to on the journey home." When Dan escorted her back to the boarding house, the night air had turned cool. Without comment, he removed his jacket and placed it around her shoulders, a simple, thoughtful gesture that spoke volumes about his character. At the door, he took her hand gently in his. "Take care of yourself while I'm gone," he said. "I'll be back before you know it." "Be safe on the road," Grace replied. "Those Kentucky horses are lucky to have you looking after them." Dan's eyes held hers for a long moment, and Grace thought he might kiss her. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips as he had the night before. "Good night, Grace. Good night, Dan," she whispered. As she watched him walk away into the darkness, Grace acknowledged to herself what she had been trying to deny. She was falling for Daniel Baxter, with his straightforward manner and kind heart. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Time would tell whether this unexpected connection was the beginning of something lasting or merely a pleasant distraction in her new life. For now, Grace decided as she entered the boarding house, she would allow herself to hope. The days following Dan's departure passed quickly for Grace, filled with preparations for both the shop and her move to the living quarters above it. Her supplies from Omaha arrived: midweek bolts of ribbon, rolls of fine wire for hat frames, bundles of feathers and artificial flowers. The Chicago shipment would take longer, but she had enough materials now to begin creating an initial inventory. On Thursday, she relocated from Mrs. Peterson's boarding house to her new home above the millinery. The space was modest: a sitting room with a small cook stove, a bedroom barely large enough for her bed and wardrobe, and a tiny washroom, but it was hers. After years of living under others' roofs, first her parents' and then as a lodger, the sense of independence was exhilarating. "It's not much," she told Mrs. Wilson, who had stopped by to help her settle in, "but it feels like a palace to me." "Every woman deserves a place to call her own," Mrs. Wilson agreed, helping Grace arrange dishes in the small cupboard. Eliza loved living above the shop. Said it made her feel like the captain of her own ship. Grace smiled at the image. "That's exactly how it feels." Mrs. Wilson paused in her work, giving Grace a thoughtful look. "Thomas and I were pleased to see you and Daniel at the social. He's a good man." "Yes, he seems to be," Grace replied carefully. "More than seems," Mrs. Wilson said firmly. "We've known him for 5 years, watched him work harder than any man on our ranch, never complaining, always honest and fair. Thomas trusts him with our most valuable horses, and Thomas doesn't trust easily." Grace wasn't sure how to respond to this obvious endorsement. "Dan has been very kind since my arrival," Mrs. Wilson smiled knowingly. "He's never shown interest in any of the local girls, you know, polite to everyone, of course, but never singled anyone out, until you." Heat rose in Grace's cheeks. "We've only just met, Mrs. Wilson." "Sometimes that's all it takes," the older woman replied with a wink. "My Thomas and I knew within a week of meeting that we'd spend our lives together. Been 30 years now, and I've never regretted a day." The conversation left Grace with much to ponder as she continued settling into her new home. Was she ready for the kind of relationship Mrs. Wilson was hinting at? After Charles, she had sworn off romantic entanglements, determined to focus solely on building her business and independence. Yet in less than a week, Dan Baxter had begun to dismantle those carefully constructed defenses. Friday morning brought dark clouds and a steady drizzle, matching Grace's increasingly worried mood. Dan had said they would return by Friday or Saturday at the latest, and with each passing hour, she found herself glancing out the shop window, hoping to catch sight of him riding down the street. By Saturday afternoon, with still no sign of Dan or the Wilson party, Grace was finding it difficult to concentrate on her work. The rain had intensified overnight, turning the streets of North Platte to mud and the prairie beyond to a sodden expanse. If Dan and the others were still on the trail, they would be facing miserable conditions. Grace was arranging a display of newly completed hats when the shop door opened, admitting Sheriff Miller along with a gust of damp air. She greeted him with a smile that faltered when she saw his serious expression. "Sheriff Miller, how can I help you?" she asked, setting aside the hat she'd been positioning. "Miss Keller," he acknowledged, removing his rain-soaked hat. "I thought you might want to know we've received word about the Wilson party." Grace's heart seemed to stop momentarily. "Are they all right?" "Delayed by the weather and some trouble at the river crossing," Miller explained. A rider came in from the halfway station, said Wilson and his men had to take shelter there when the rain made the trail impassable. "They've got the horses with them, all safe, but they won't make it back until the weather clears." Relief washed over Grace. "Thank you for letting me know, Sheriff." "I've been concerned with this storm," Miller nodded. "Figured you might be, seeing as how you and Baxter have been keeping company." News traveled fast in North Platte, Grace reflected. "We've become friends," she said simply. "Good man, Baxter," Miller commented, echoing Mrs. Wilson's assessment. "Anyway, thought you'd want to know they're safe, just delayed. Probably be back Monday or Tuesday, depending on when this rain lets up." After the sheriff left, Grace returned to her work with a lighter heart. Dan was safe delayed, but not in danger. The knowledge allowed her to focus on preparing the shop for its official opening, which she had scheduled for the following Friday. The rain continued through Sunday, keeping most of North Platte's residents indoors. Grace attended the small church near the town square, where she was warmly welcomed by many of the people she had met at the social. Several women inquired about her shop opening, and by the end of the service, Grace had promises from at least a dozen potential customers to visit in the first week. Monday dawned clear at last, the storm having moved eastward overnight. The streets were still muddy, but the sun shone brightly, quickly drying the puddles and raising spirits throughout the town. Grace spent the morning cleaning the shop windows to a high shine and arranging her completed hats on the display stands, creating an inviting tableau for passing townspeople to admire. Around midday, she heard a commotion in the street, voices calling, horses' hooves, the rattle of wagons. Looking out, she saw a small procession entering the main street of North Platte. Several riders accompanying a string of magnificent horses, their coats gleaming even at a distance. Leading the procession was a figure she recognized immediately: Dan, sitting tall in the saddle of his chestnut horse. Without stopping to think, Grace grabbed her shawl and hurried outside, joining other townspeople who had emerged to witness the arrival. She stood on the boardwalk, watching as Dan and the others guided the Kentucky horses toward the Wilson Ranch at the edge of town. As the procession passed her shop, Dan spotted her. His face, weary from the journey, brightened visibly. He raised a hand in greeting, calling out, "Miss Keller." "Welcome back, Mr. Baxter," she called in return, propriety demanding formality despite the joy she felt at seeing him safe. Dan said something to one of the other riders, who nodded in response. Breaking away from the procession, Dan guided his horse to the edge of the boardwalk where Grace stood. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Been thinking about you the whole journey back. I was worried when you didn't return by Saturday," Grace admitted. "The rain turned the trail to soup," Dan explained, "and we had some trouble at the river crossing, nothing serious but enough to delay us." His eyes roamed her face as if memorizing her features. "I need to get these horses to the ranch, but I'll come by as soon as I can, tomorrow if Wilson can spare me." "I'll be here," Grace promised. With a tip of his hat and a smile that warmed her despite the cool autumn air, Dan rejoined the procession. Grace watched until they disappeared around the corner, heading toward the Wilson property. The next day passed with agonizing slowness as Grace waited for Dan's visit. She kept herself busy with final preparations for the shop opening, arranging and rearranging displays, polishing counters that already gleamed, and putting the finishing touches on several hats. By late afternoon, she had begun to wonder if Dan would come at all when the shop door opened and he stood there, hat in hand. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it," Grace said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "Wilson kept us busy all day with those Kentucky thoroughbreds," Dan explained, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Beautiful animals, but high-strung after the long journey, took hours to get them settled. Now that he was here, standing before her, Grace felt suddenly shy. During his absence, her feelings had intensified in a way that surprised her. The reality of his presence, his tall frame, those clear blue eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious, was almost overwhelming. "The shop looks wonderful," Dan said, glancing around at the displays. "You've accomplished so much in just a week." "Thank you," Grace replied, regaining her composure. "I'm opening officially on Friday." "You'll be busy from sunrise to sunset," Dan predicted with a smile. "Every woman in North Platte has been talking about nothing else since you arrived." "I hope so," Grace said. "I've invested everything in making this work." Dan stepped closer, his expression turning serious. "I missed you, Grace, more than I expected to." The directness of his statement caught her off guard. "I missed you too," she admitted softly. "I know we haven't known each other long," Dan continued, "but these past days, all I could think about was getting back to North Platte, getting back to you." Grace's heart quickened at his words. "Dan, I'm not asking for any promises," he hastened to add. "I know your business comes first, and that's as it should be, but I'd like to court you properly if you'll allow it. Get to know you better, let you get to know me." The request was so different from Charles's aggressive pursuit, so respectful of her priorities and independence, that Grace found herself deeply moved. "I'd like that too," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Very much." Dan's smile could have lit the darkening shop. "You've made me the happiest man in Nebraska, Grace Keller." The formality of his words contrasted with the boyish joy in his expression, making Grace laugh softly. "You haven't even kissed me yet, Mr. Baxter. Perhaps you should reserve judgment on your happiness." The invitation was bolder than Grace had intended, but she didn't regret it. She had spent too long living in fear, denying herself joy because of one man's cruelty. Here now, with Dan looking at her as if she were the most wonderful thing he'd ever seen, she chose courage. Dan stepped closer, raising one hand to gently cup her cheek. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice husky. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Dan lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. His mouth was warm and gentle against hers, asking nothing, giving everything. Grace's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself as the shop seemed to tilt around them. When they finally parted, Dan rested his forehead against hers, his breath coming quicker than before. "Definitely the happiest man in Nebraska," he murmured. "Possibly in the entire Western Territory." Grace laughed, the sound mingling with the happy tears that had escaped down her cheeks. "And I may be the happiest milliner west of Chicago." Dan brushed the tears away with his thumb, his touch reverent. "Does this mean you'll let me take you on that ride I promised? Sunday after church, perhaps? The prairie is beautiful this time of year, especially after a rain." "I'd love that," Grace agreed. As Dan reluctantly took his leave a short time later, promising to return the next day to help with any final preparations for the shop opening, Grace stood in the doorway watching him go, a sense of wonder filling her heart. She had come to North Platte seeking a fresh start, a place to build a business and a life free from painful memories. She hadn't been looking for love, had, in fact, been determined to avoid it. Yet here it was, finding her anyway, in the form of a straightforward cowboy with kind eyes and gentle hands. Perhaps, Grace thought as she closed the shop door, this unexpected detour was exactly the journey she was meant to take all along. The millinery shop opened on Friday morning to more fanfare than Grace had anticipated. Word had spread through North Platte about the quality of her work, and by the time she unlocked the door at 9 o'clock, a small crowd of women had gathered outside, eager to be among the first to view and purchase her creations. "Ladies, welcome to Grace's Millinery," she greeted them, trying to hide her nervousness behind a professional smile as she ushered them inside. What followed was a whirlwind of activity that left Grace breathless. Women examined hats, tried them on, exclaimed over the craftsmanship, and placed orders for custom designs. By noon, she had sold 6 ready-made hats and taken orders for 12 more, a success beyond her most optimistic projections. Mrs. Wilson was among the first customers, purchasing a practical bonnet for everyday wear and commissioning a more elaborate hat for church services. "I told you you'd be busy from dawn till dusk," she said with satisfaction as Grace wrote up her order. "Every woman in town has been making do with mail-order hats or hand-me-downs since Eliza passed. We've been desperate for a proper milliner." "I'm grateful for the warm welcome," Grace replied sincerely. "I wasn't sure how quickly I'd establish myself here." Mrs. Wilson patted her hand. "You're filling a need, dear. That's always the key to success in a place like North Platte." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And I must say, having Daniel Baxter's attention hasn't hurt your reception either. Everyone's curious about the woman who caught his eye after all this time." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Dan and I are getting to know each other." "I've never seen him so happy," Mrs. Wilson said approvingly. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." The shop remained busy throughout the afternoon, with a steady stream of customers that finally began to taper off as evening approached. Grace was recording the day's sales in her ledger when the bell above the door jingled once more. Looking up, she was delighted to see Dan entering, his expression eager. "I hear you've had quite a successful opening day," he said, removing his hat as he approached the counter. Mrs. Wilson came back to the ranch positively giddy about her new bonnet. "It's been wonderful," Grace confirmed. "Better than I dared hope." "I'm not surprised," Dan said, his pride in her evident. "Your work is exceptional." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I brought you something, a small gift to celebrate your opening." Surprised and touched, Grace accepted the package. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Dan replied simply. "Go on, open it." Grace untied the string carefully and unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box with a delicately carved design of prairie flowers on the lid. Opening it, she found a silver thimble nestled on a bed of soft fabric. "It was my mother's," Dan explained softly. "She was a fine seamstress, taught me to appreciate careful craftsmanship. I thought she would have wanted you to have it." The gift left Grace momentarily speechless. That he would give her something so personal, so connected to his mother, spoke volumes about his feelings. "Dan, I can't accept this," she finally managed. "It's too precious." "Please," he insisted gently. "It's been sitting unused in my trunk for years. My mother would have hated that. She'd want it to be used by someone who understands the value of creating beautiful things with their hands." The sincerity in his eyes made further protest impossible. "Thank you," Grace said, carefully lifting the thimble from its box. "I'll treasure it." "I was hoping I might escort you to dinner," Dan said, changing the subject as if embarrassed by her emotion. "You must be hungry after such a busy day." "I'd like that," Grace agreed, placing the thimble back in its box with reverence. "Just let me close up the shop." As they walked to the hotel dining room a short time later, Dan offered his arm, which Grace accepted with a sense of rightness that surprised her. In just over a week, this man had become an integral part of her new life in North Platte, a source of support, of joy, of possibilities she hadn't dared consider. "I meant to ask," Dan said as they settled at their table, "are we still on for that ride on Sunday?" "Weather's supposed to be perfect, cool but sunny." "Yes, I'm looking forward to it," Grace replied, "though I should warn you I haven't been on horseback in years." "Don't worry," Dan assured her. "I'll find you the gentlest mare in Wilson's stable, and we can take it slow." Their dinner conversation flowed easily, covering everything from the success of the shop opening to Dan's work at the ranch to childhood memories that made them both laugh. By the time they finished their meal, Grace felt as if she'd known Dan for years rather than days. As they walked back to the shop in the gathering dusk, Dan's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. The simple contact sent warmth through Grace's entire body. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find this has all been a dream," Dan said softly. "Meeting you on that trail, getting to know you, it feels like something out of a storybook." "If it's a dream, we're sharing it," Grace replied, squeezing his hand gently. When they reached the shop, Dan turned to face her, still holding her hand. "Grace, I want you to know. I'm not rushing this. Whatever happens between us, it'll be at a pace that feels right for both of us. Your business, your independence, those come first." The words were exactly what Grace needed to hear, an assurance that Dan understood her priorities, that he respected her need to establish herself before committing fully to a relationship. "Thank you for understanding," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "After what happened in Chicago." She stopped, realizing she was about to reveal more than she'd intended, but perhaps it was time. If they were to move forward together, Dan deserved to know why she sometimes hesitated, why trust came harder to her than it should. "What happened in Chicago?" Dan asked gently, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Grace took a deep breath. "There was a man, Charles. We were engaged briefly. When I broke it off, he made life very difficult for me, used his influence to damage my reputation, threatened me." She looked down, unable to meet Dan's eyes as she continued. "It's why I left Chicago. I needed to go somewhere he couldn't reach me." Dan was silent for a long moment. When Grace finally looked up, she saw not pity in his expression, but a controlled anger that surprised her. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said, his voice tight. "No one should have to leave their home because of threats from someone who claimed to care for them." "It was a long time ago," Grace said, though in reality it had been only months. "Not so long," Dan disagreed gently. "And experiences like that leave marks that take time to heal." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I'll never rush you, Grace, and I'll never use my feelings for you as a way to control or hurt you. That's a promise." The sincerity in his voice, the steadiness of his gaze, made Grace believe him completely. This man was nothing like Charles, nothing like anyone she'd ever known. "I believe you," she whispered. Dan's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Good, now I should let you rest. You've had an exhausting day, and you'll probably have another busy one tomorrow." "Will I see you before Sunday?" Grace asked. "Try to keep me away," Dan replied with a grin. "I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon if that's all right." "More than all right," Grace assured him. This time, when Dan leaned down to kiss her goodnight, there was a new depth to their connection, a understanding born of shared confidences and growing trust. His lips were gentle against hers, but there was a promise in the kiss that made Grace's heart race. As she watched him walk away down the darkening street, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. The shop's successful opening, Dan's thoughtful gift, his understanding response to her revelation about Charles all combined to make her feel more secure in her new life than she had since arriving in North Platte. For the first time since leaving Chicago, Grace felt not just hopeful about the future, but genuinely excited for what tomorrow might bring. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for a ride across the prairie. Grace dressed with care in her most practical skirt, a divided riding skirt she had crafted before leaving Chicago, and a warm jacket over a simple blouse. She arranged her hair in a practical knot that would fit under her hat, a wide-brimmed felt creation designed to shield her face from both sun and wind. Dan arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, leading 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a pretty dappled gray mare with a gentle eye. "This is Daisy," he said, introducing Grace to the mare. "Gentlest horse on Wilson's ranch, perfect for someone getting back in the saddle after a long absence." Grace approached the horse cautiously, holding out her hand for the mare to sniff. "She's beautiful, Mrs. Wilson rides her sometimes," Dan explained. "Says she's like sitting in a rocking chair, so smooth is her gait." With Dan's assistance, Grace mounted, relieved to find that her body remembered the proper posture despite the years since she'd last been on horseback. Her father had taught her to ride as a child during summer visits to her grandparents' farm outside Chicago, but after his death, There had been neither opportunity nor funds for such pursuits. "You look like you were born to the saddle," Dan commented as he mounted his own horse. "Ready for an adventure? Lead the way," Grace replied with a smile. They rode out of town at a leisurely pace, Dan keeping Daisy's reins loosely in his hand until he was satisfied that Grace was comfortable controlling the mare herself. The prairie opened before them as they left North Platte behind a vast expanse of tawny grass rippling in the gentle breeze, dotted with late-blooming wildflowers, and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees marking the course of hidden streams. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, taking in the landscape. "So different from anything I knew in Chicago. It grows on you," Dan said, guiding his horse alongside hers. "When I first came west, I thought I'd never get used to all this open space. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else." As they rode, Dan pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area which hills had the best wildflowers in spring, where he'd once spotted a wolf pack loping across the winter snow, which distant bluff was said to have been a lookout point for Pawnee hunters long before white settlers arrived. They paused to rest the horses near a small creek, dismounting to let the animals drink. Dan spread a blanket he'd brought in his saddlebag on a patch of grass beneath a cottonwood tree, producing a simple picnic lunch: bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of Mrs. Wilson's strawberry preserves. "This is wonderful," Grace said as they settled on the blanket. "Thank you for bringing me out here." "I've been wanting to show you this country since the day we met," Dan admitted, handing her a slice of bread spread with preserves. "There's something special about sharing a place you love with someone who might come to love it too." The simple statement carried implications that might have frightened Grace a week ago, but now filled her with a warm glow of possibility. Dan wasn't just sharing the landscape with her, he was sharing his life, his future, inviting her to envision herself as part of it. "I think I could come to love it very easily," she said softly. "It has a wild beauty that gets under your skin." "Like someone else I know," Dan replied, his blue eyes meeting hers with warmth. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the gentle sounds of the prairie, the creek's quiet burbling, the rustle of grass in the breeze, the occasional call of a meadowlark. When they had finished their meal, Dan leaned back against the tree trunk, his expression turning thoughtful. "Can I ask you something, Grace?" "Of course," she replied, curious about his suddenly serious tone. "Why millinery? Of all the trades you might have chosen, why hat making?" The question surprised her. Few people had ever asked about her choice of profession, most simply accepted it as a suitable occupation for a woman. "It combines so many things I love," she explained after a moment's thought. "The artistry of design, the practicality of creating something useful, the joy of seeing someone transformed when they find the perfect hat that makes them feel beautiful or confident." She smiled, remembering. "My mother loved beautiful hats." "Some of my earliest memories are of watching her get ready for church or special occasions, how she would position her hat just so, checking her reflection with such satisfaction." "She would be proud of what you've built," Dan said. "I hope so," Grace replied softly. "After she died, I needed to find a way to support myself and help my father, who was already in failing health. Madame Laurent took me on as an apprentice, and I discovered I had a genuine talent for the work. It wasn't just a means to earn a living, it became a passion." Dan nodded, understanding. "That's how I feel about working with horses. Started as just a job, became something more, something that gave me purpose when I needed it most." "After the war?" Grace asked gently. "Yes," Dan confirmed, his gaze distant now. "I came home, changed. Couldn't settle back into farm life like my brother did. Felt restless, haunted by things I'd seen, things I'd done." He looked at her directly. "I never talk about this, not with anyone." "You don't have to tell me," Grace assured him, though part of her longed to know this aspect of him, to understand what had shaped the man he'd become. "I want to," Dan said simply. If this is going where I hope it is, you deserve to know." The implication sent a thrill through Grace, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "I was 19 when I enlisted," Dan said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Thought I was a man, thought I understood what war meant. I didn't, none of us did." He plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between his fingers as he spoke. Saw things no one should have to see, lost friends, took lives. He paused. That changes a person. I can only imagine, Grace said softly. When I came home, I couldn't talk about it. My family wanted the boy who'd left, but he was gone. In his place was someone they didn't recognize, someone who woke up shouting in the night, who couldn't stand being confined indoors, who jumped at loud noises. Dan's eyes remained fixed on the blade of grass in his hands. My brother tried to understand, but how could he? My father, well, he just drank more. My mother was the only one who seemed to accept that I'd changed, that I needed time and space. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Grace observed. She was, Dan agreed, a small smile softening his features. When she passed 2 years after I returned, there was nothing keeping me in Missouri anymore. I headed west with no real destination in mind, just a need to keep moving. Until you reached North Platte, Grace concluded. Dan nodded. Wilson gave me a job breaking horses, something about working with them animals that had never been touched by human conflict or cruelty. It started to heal something in me. They don't judge or expect, they just respond to how you treat them. Treat them with patience and respect, they give the same back. Like people should, Grace said. Like people should, Dan agreed, meeting her eyes again, but often don't. The vulnerability in his expression moved Grace deeply. That he would share this part of himself, these memories he kept private from others, spoke volumes about his trust in her, his hopes for their future together. Without thinking, she reached out, covering his hand with hers. Thank you for telling me. Dan turned his hand to clasp hers, his grip warm and strong. Thank you for listening. He hesitated, then added, I want you to know me, Grace. All of me, not just the man I am now, but how I became him, the good and the bad. I want to know all of you too, Grace replied softly. And I want you to know me, even the parts that aren't pretty or easy to share. They sat together in silence for a long moment, hands entwined, each absorbing the significance of what had just passed between them. This was more than attraction, more than the excitement of a new connection. This was the beginning of something deeper, a foundation being laid, stone by careful stone. Eventually, Dan squeezed her hand gently. We should start heading back if we want to reach town before dusk. They packed up the remains of their picnic and remounted their horses, setting off toward North Platte at a leisurely pace. The ride back was quieter, both of them contemplative after their exchange of confidences, but it was a comfortable silence filled with unspoken understanding. As the town came into view, Grace found herself reluctant for their day together to end. She had come to North Platte seeking independence, a fresh start focused on her business rather than romantic entanglements. Yet here she was, barely 2 weeks after arriving, finding herself deeply drawn to this thoughtful, honest man who had quite literally appeared on the horizon when she needed help. Penny for your thoughts, Dan said as they approached the outskirts of town. Grace smiled. I was just thinking how differently things might have turned out if my wagon hadn't broken down that day or if someone else had come along to help me. I like to think we would have found each other anyway, Dan replied. Some things are meant to be, wagon axles notwithstanding. The simple faith in his statement warmed Grace's heart. Perhaps you're right. As they rode through town toward the livery where Daisy would be stabled, several people called greetings or tipped their hats. Grace was becoming accustomed to the friendliness of North Platte, so different from the anonymity of Chicago. After leaving the horses at the livery, Dan walked Grace back to her shop, their hands finding each other naturally as they strolled through the quiet Sunday afternoon streets. Thank you for today, Grace said as they reached her door. It was perfect. The first of many perfect days, I hope, Dan replied, his expression earnest. Standing there in the golden light of late afternoon, Grace felt a certainty settle over her, a knowledge that this man, this place, this moment was exactly where she was meant to be. The fears that had haunted her since leaving Chicago seemed distant now, overshadowed by the promise of what might grow between them. When Dan leaned down to kiss her, she met him halfway, her arms sliding around his neck as his encircled her waist. Unlike their previous kisses, tentative and brief, this one deepened, expressing feelings that words hadn't yet captured. Grace lost herself in the sensation, in the security of his embrace, in the rightness of his lips against hers. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Dan rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you, Grace Keller," he whispered. "I know it's soon, but I need you to know that." The declaration, so heartfelt and direct, might have frightened her once. Now it filled her with joy. "I'm falling in love with you too, Daniel Baxter," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "And it terrifies me almost as much as it thrills me." Dan pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, his own filled with understanding. "We'll take it one day at a time. No rushing, no pressure, just us figuring this out together." Grace nodded, grateful for his patience, for his willingness to move at a pace that felt comfortable for her. "One day at a time," she agreed. As Dan reluctantly took his leave, promising to stop by the shop the next day, Grace watched him go with a sense of wonder. The wagon axle breaking on that dusty trail had seemed like a disaster at the time, a frustrating delay in her journey to a new life. Now she recognized it for what it truly was, not an obstacle but a beginning. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Grace's life. The millinery shop thrived beyond her expectations, with orders coming not just from North Platte but from surrounding communities as well. Word spread about the quality of her work, bringing customers from as far as 20 miles away to commission hats or purchase her ready-made designs. And alongside her professional success blossomed her relationship with Dan. True to his word, he courted her with patience and respect, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. They established a comfortable routine: dinners several times a week, Sunday rides when the weather permitted, quiet evenings in the sitting room above her shop where they talked for hours about everything and nothing. October gave way to November, bringing colder temperatures and the first light snowfalls. The approaching winter meant changes to life in North Platte, shops closing earlier as darkness fell sooner, social gatherings moving indoors, preparations being made for the long, cold months ahead. For Grace, it also meant adapting her inventory to include warmer hats, felt bonnets lined with silk, sturdy wool caps for men, fashionable fur-trimmed designs for ladies attending winter socials. The work kept her busy from morning till night, but she relished the challenge and the knowledge that her business was establishing a solid foundation. On a particularly cold evening in late November, Grace was working late in her shop, finishing a special order for the mayor's wife when Dan arrived for their planned dinner. He stomped snow from his boots at the door, his face ruddy from the cold. "Bitter out there tonight," he commented, unwinding his scarf. "Wilson says it's going to be a hard winter." "He seems to be right," Grace replied, setting aside her work to greet him with a kiss. The temperatures dropped steadily all day. Dan held her close for a moment longer than usual, as if drawing warmth from her presence. When he released her, his expression was uncharacteristically serious. "Grace, there's something I need to discuss with you." The formality in his tone sent a flutter of nervousness through her. "That sounds ominous." Dan shook his head quickly. "Nothing bad, I promise, just important." He guided her to the small settee she kept in the shop for customers, taking both her hands in his as they sat. "Wilson's expanding the ranch," he began. "Buying the old Peterson property that borders his land to the east. It's good grazing land with a solid house and barn." "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity for him," Grace said, not quite understanding why Dan was so serious about the news. "It is," Dan agreed. "And it's an opportunity for me as well." He took a deep breath. "Wilson's offered me the position of managing the new property. I'd oversee the cattle operation there, have use of the house." He hesitated. "It's a step up from head wrangler, more responsibility, better pay." "Dan, that's wonderful," Grace exclaimed, genuinely pleased for him. "You deserve the recognition." "Thank you," he said, a small smile breaking through his serious demeanor, "but there's more to it than that." He squeezed her hands gently. "The house on the property. It's not large, but it's solid. 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a porch that wraps around the front, room for a garden come spring." The implication behind his words began to dawn on Grace. Her heart raced as Dan continued. Grace, these past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, watching you build your business, falling more in love with you every day. He swallowed visibly. I know we agreed to take things slow, and I've tried to honor that, but I can't imagine my future without you in it. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that looked well worn but carefully tended. This was my mother's, he said softly, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. My father gave it to her when they had nothing but dreams in each other. His eyes, bluer than ever in the lamplight, met hers directly. Grace Keller, will you marry me? Will you make a home with me on that little piece of prairie and build a life together? Though she had begun to suspect where the conversation was heading, the actual proposal still took Grace's breath away. She stared at the ring, at Dan's hopeful face, emotions swirling through her: joy, excitement, and yes, a lingering trace of fear. The shop. She began hesitantly. I've worked so hard to establish it. I would never ask you to give it up, Dan assured her quickly. The Peterson property is only 4 miles from town. You could ride in daily to open the shop, or we could hire someone to help you so you wouldn't need to be there every day. Whatever arrangement works best for the business you've built. The thoughtfulness of his response, the way he had clearly considered her professional needs alongside his proposal, touched Grace deeply. And if I'm not ready yet, she asked softly, if I need more time. Dan closed the ring box gently, taking her hand again. Then I'll wait a month, a year, however long you need. My feelings won't change, Grace. When you're ready, I'll be here. Looking into his earnest face, Grace realized that her hesitation wasn't about whether she wanted to marry Dan on that point. Her heart was certain. Her hesitation stemmed from old fears, from the scars left by Charles's betrayal, from a reflexive protection of the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. But Dan wasn't Charles. He had proven that in countless ways over the past 2 months through his respect for her work, his patience with her caution, his willingness to share his own vulnerabilities alongside his strengths. He didn't seek to possess her or control her. He wanted to build something with her as equals. I don't need more time, Grace said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. I love you, Dan, and yes, I'll marry you. The joy that transformed Dan's face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. He opened the ring box again with hands that trembled slightly, removing the simple band and sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. You've made me the happiest man alive, Dan whispered, framing her face with his hands before leaning in to kiss her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. When they parted, both were smiling through tears of joy. When, Grace asked simply. Spring would be traditional, Dan replied. Give us time to prepare the house for you to make arrangements with the shop, but I'm at your disposal, Miss Keller, whenever you say the word. Grace considered. Winter was settling in, making extensive preparations difficult. And spring would indeed be a beautiful time for a wedding, with the prairie coming back to life after the long, cold months. Spring sounds perfect, she agreed. Perhaps early April when the first wildflowers appear. April it is, Dan said, kissing her again, more deeply this time. When he finally pulled away, his expression was one of pure happiness. Should we still go to dinner, or would you rather stay here and start planning our future? Grace laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Both, I think. I'm suddenly famished, but I also can't wait to tell you all my ideas for the house. They did indeed do both, sharing a celebratory meal at the hotel dining room, where their news was met with congratulations from other diners who overheard, then returning to Grace's sitting room above the shop to talk late into the night about their dreams for their shared future. As snow fell softly outside the window, they sat close together on Grace's small sofa, Dan's arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, the lamplight catching the modest sparkle of her engagement ring. I never expected this when I left Chicago, Grace mused. I was so focused on establishing the shop, on being independent. And now, Dan prompted gently, Now I realize that true independence isn't about being alone, Grace replied thoughtfully. It's about choosing who to share your life with on your own terms. Dan pressed a kiss to her temple. And I'm honored to be your choice. As she drifted off to sleep that night after Dan had reluctantly taken his leave, Grace found herself thinking of that moment on the trail when her wagon axle broke the despair she had felt, the uncertainty about what would happen next. How could she have known that what seemed like disaster was actually the first step toward the greatest happiness she had ever known? Life, she reflected drowsily, had a way of breaking down exactly when you needed to pause long enough for something wonderful to find you. The winter of 1874 proved to be as harsh as Wilson had predicted. Heavy snows blanketed North Platte for weeks at a time, temperatures plunged to bitter lows, and wind howled across the prairie with a vengeance that tested even the sturdiest buildings. Despite the challenges of the weather, Grace's millinery business continued to thrive, with women using their indoor confinement during the cold months to plan spring wardrobes and commission new hats for the Easter season. Meanwhile, preparations for the April wedding proceeded at a steady pace. Grace set aside time each week to work on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk with delicate lace trim that she labored over in the evenings after the shop closed. Dan, with help from Wilson and other ranch hands, used the coldest days when outdoor work was impossible to make improvements to the house on the Peterson property, repairing the roof, replacing worn floorboards, building new shelves and cupboards for the kitchen. When weather permitted, Dan would bring Grace to see the progress, bundling her into a sleigh for the journey across the snow-covered prairie to what would soon be their home. Each visit filled Grace with growing excitement. The house was indeed modest, a two-bedroom frame structure with a central parlor and kitchen, but it was solid and warm, with large windows that filled the rooms with light even on winter days. "It needs a woman's touch," Dan acknowledged during one such visit in February as they stood in the empty parlor. "Curtains, rugs, all those things that make a house a home." "It will have them," Grace promised, already envisioning how she would transform the simple space with items she was carefully setting aside from her earnings: colorful quilts for the beds, cheerful curtains for the windows, comfortable chairs drawn up before the hearth. By March, as the worst of winter's grip began to ease, final wedding plans were underway. Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Wilson took charge of organizing the reception, which would be held at the town hall after a ceremony in the small church where Grace had been attending services since her arrival. The entire town seemed invested in the upcoming nuptials, the first major celebration since the Christmas social, with women offering to contribute food for the reception, and men volunteering to decorate the town hall. "You'd think royalty was getting married," Grace commented to Dan one evening as they sat in her sitting room, reviewing the growing list of well-wishers who planned to attend. "I've only been here 6 months, but you've made an impression," Dan replied, squeezing her hand affectionately. "Besides, North Platte loves any excuse for a celebration, especially after a long winter." As the snow melted and the first tentative signs of spring began to appear, Grace found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been in Chicago, trapped in a situation that seemed to offer no escape, her future clouded by fear and uncertainty. Now she was preparing to marry a man who respected and supported her, running a successful business in a community that had embraced her, looking forward to a future bright with promise. The night before the wedding, Grace closed the shop early. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Daniel Baxter, and while she would reopen the millinery the following week, tonight was for reflection and preparation. She was putting the finishing touches on her wedding dress when a knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Mrs. Wilson standing there with a small wrapped package in her hands. "I hope I'm not intruding, dear," the older woman said. "I wanted to bring you something for tomorrow." "You're not intruding at all," Grace assured her, ushering her inside. "Please come in, Mrs. Wilson settled on the small sofa, patting the space beside her for Grace to join her. I've come to think of you almost as a daughter these past months, she began, her voice warm with affection. Thomas and I never had children of our own, you know, and Daniel. Well, he's been like a son to us since he came to the ranch. She handed the package to Grace. This is something I want you to have, a wedding gift of sorts, though different from the household items you'll receive tomorrow. Curious, Grace unwrapped the package to find a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This was my mother's, Mrs. Wilson explained. She started it on her wedding day and wrote in it throughout her marriage bits of wisdom, recipes, remedies, reflections on life as a pioneer wife. When she passed, she gave it to me to continue, and I've added my own thoughts over the years. Grace opened the journal carefully, noting the different handwritings that filled its pages, some faded with time, others more recent. I want you to have it, Mrs. Wilson continued, to add your own wisdom as you begin your life with Daniel. And perhaps someday to pass it on to a daughter or daughter-in-law of your own. Tears pricked at Grace's eyes at the thoughtful gift. Mrs. Wilson, I don't know what to say. This is so precious. Are you certain you want to part with it? The older woman patted Grace's hand. More than certain. My mother always said wisdom is meant to be shared, not hoarded, and you and Daniel are embarking on a journey that will have its share of joys and challenges. The collected wisdom of women who have walked similar paths might be a comfort on difficult days. Grace embraced Mrs. Wilson impulsively. Thank you. I'll treasure it and I'll add to it faithfully. After Mrs. Wilson left, Grace spent some time reading through the journal, marveling at the glimpses into the lives of women who had faced the challenges of frontier life before her. Their words practical advice about maintaining a home, reflections on marriage and partnership, observations about the changing seasons of life offered a sense of connection to a lineage of strong women who had built lives in this harsh but beautiful land. Later, as she prepared for bed on her last night as Grace Keller, she added her own first entry to the journal. Tomorrow I marry Daniel Baxter, a man I met by chance on a dusty trail when my wagon broke down miles from town. Some might call it luck or coincidence, but I've come to believe it was something more, a moment when life's path shifted, leading me exactly where I needed to go, though I didn't know it at the time. As I begin this new chapter, I carry with me gratitude for broken wagon axles and kind cowboys who stopped to help strangers in need. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the promise of spring across the prairie. Wildflowers were just beginning to appear in sheltered spots, tiny purple and yellow blooms pushing through the winter brown grass, as if nature herself had decided to decorate for the occasion. In the small room at the back of the church that served as a bride's preparation area, Grace stood still as Mrs. Peterson and Miss Wallace from the boarding house helped her into her wedding dress. The ivory silk rustled softly as it settled around her, the lace at the collar and cuffs adding a delicate touch of elegance to the simple design. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Peterson declared, arranging the modest train. "Daniel won't be able to take his eyes off you." Grace smiled, a mixture of nervousness and joy fluttering in her stomach. "I can hardly believe this day is finally here." "Having second thoughts?" Miss Wallace asked, securing a spray of small white flowers in Grace's upswept hair. "Not at all," Grace replied with certainty. "Just overwhelmed by how much has changed in 6 months. When I arrived in North Platte, I never imagined I'd be standing here today." "Life has a way of surprising us," Mrs. Peterson observed wisely, "often for the better when we're open to it." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Thomas Wilson, who had offered to escort Grace down the aisle in the absence of her father. He entered at Mrs. Peterson's call, stopping short at the sight of Grace in her wedding finery. "My dear girl," he said, his usually gruff voice softened with emotion, "you are a vision. Daniel is a fortunate man indeed." "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Grace replied, touched by his evident sincerity. "And thank you for standing in for my father today. It means more than I can express." Wilson offered his arm. "It's my honor. Shall we proceed? I believe there's a rather nervous young man waiting at the altar." The small church was filled to capacity, with seemingly the entire population of North Platte and surrounding ranches in attendance. As the simple organ music began a hymn played by the schoolteacher, all heads turned to watch Grace enter on Wilson's arm. But Grace had eyes only for Dan, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new suit purchased specially for the occasion. His face, as he watched her approach, reflected everything in her own heart: love, joy, a touch of disbelief that this moment had arrived, and above all, a certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with Pastor Roberts speaking eloquently about the commitment they were making not just to each other, but to building a life together based on mutual respect, support, and love. When the time came to speak their vows, Grace's voice was clear and steady, as was Dan's, both of them promising to cherish and honor each other for all the days of their lives. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Roberts concluded with a broad smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride." As Dan's lips met hers in their first kiss as a married couple, Grace felt a sense of rightness, of completion, that confirmed every decision that had led her to this moment. The cheers and applause that erupted from the congregation barely registered as they shared this private moment of joy amidst the public celebration. The reception at the town hall afterward was a true community affair, with tables laden with food contributed by half the women in North Platte, music provided by local musicians, and enough good wishes to last a lifetime. Grace and Dan moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and gifts, sharing their first dance as husband and wife, cutting the beautiful cake Mrs. Wilson had prepared. As the celebration continued into the evening, Dan leaned close to whisper in Grace's ear, "Ready to see our home, Mrs. Baxter?" The new name sent a thrill through Grace. "More than ready, Mr. Baxter," she replied with a smile. They made their farewells amidst good-natured teasing and well wishes, climbing into the wagon Dan had decorated with ribbons and flowers for the occasion. As they drove away from town toward their new home, the setting sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and rose, a fitting end to a perfect day. "Happy?" Dan asked, his free hand finding hers on the seat between them. "Completely," Grace assured him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. Their home, when they arrived, had been transformed by the thoughtful efforts of Wilson's ranch hands. Lanterns glowed warmly in the windows. A fire had been lit in the hearth, and someone had scattered more of the early spring wildflowers throughout the rooms. On the kitchen table sat a basket containing bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine, a wedding gift from Sheriff Miller, according to the attached note. Dan lifted Grace across the threshold with ease, setting her down gently in what was now their parlor. "Welcome home, Grace Baxter," he said softly. Grace turned in a slow circle, taking in the space that they would fill with memories in the years to come. The furniture was simple but solid: a sofa and 2 chairs before the fireplace, a small dining table with 4 chairs in the kitchen, a bed and wardrobe visible through the open door to the main bedroom. Many of her personal belongings had already been moved from the rooms above the shop, integrated with Dan's possessions to create a home that belonged to both of them. "It's perfect," she declared, meaning it completely. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their first night as husband and wife, Grace rested her head on Dan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. Outside, the prairie wind sang a gentle lullaby around the corners of the house, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "What are you thinking?" Dan asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I never expected to find this kind of happiness," Grace replied honestly. "After everything that happened in Chicago, I'd convinced myself that independence was enough, that I didn't need or want love in my life. How wrong I was." Dan's arms tightened around her. "When I saw you that day on the trail, standing beside your broken wagon with that determined look on your face, something told me my life was about to change forever." He chuckled softly. I remember thinking that fixing your wagon was the most important task I'd ever undertaken, though I couldn't have explained why. I'm glad you stopped, Grace said, pressing a kiss to his chest. And not just because you fixed my wagon. I'm glad you let me ride beside you, Dan replied, tilting her face up for a proper kiss. Not just into town, but into the rest of our lives. As sleep began to claim them, wrapped in each other's arms in the home they would share, Grace's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude for broken wagon axles and chance encounters, for second chances and new beginnings, and most of all, for the courage to open her heart to the love she had found on the wild Nebraska prairie. 5 years later, Grace stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Dan taught their 3-year-old son, Thomas, to ride his first pony. The gentle creature, barely larger than a large dog, plodded patiently in a small circle while Thomas giggled with delight, his father's steadying hand on his back. "Mama, look at me," the boy called, his blue eyes so like his father's, bright with excitement. "I see you, sweetheart," Grace called back with a smile. "You're doing wonderfully." In her arms, 1-year-old Sarah squirmed impatiently, eager to join her brother in the adventure. "Soon, little one," Grace murmured to her daughter, "when you're a bit bigger like Thomas." The years had brought many changes to their lives. The Peterson property had expanded as Dan took on increasing responsibility at the Wilson Ranch, eventually becoming a junior partner when Thomas Wilson decided to semi-retire. The house had grown along with their family, a new kitchen added last year, a second bedroom for the children, a proper studio for Grace to work on her hat designs when she wasn't at the shop in town. The millinery had flourished beyond Grace's most optimistic projections. She now employed 2 assistants, local girls she was training in the art of hat making, allowing her to split her time between the shop and home. Her designs were sought after not just in North Platte, but in Omaha and beyond, with orders coming in from as far away as Denver and St. Louis. North Platte itself had grown as well, the railroad bringing new residents and businesses, transforming the frontier town into a thriving community. Yet it retained the close-knit quality that had first welcomed Grace, with neighbors still helping neighbors through difficulties and celebrating together in times of joy. As Dan concluded Thomas's riding lesson, lifting the boy down from the pony with exaggerated ceremony, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of quiet domestic happiness. There had been challenges, of course, a difficult first pregnancy, a fire at the shop that had required rebuilding part of the structure, a particularly harsh winter when Dan had fallen ill with pneumonia, frightening them all with its severity. But through each challenge, their love had deepened, their partnership strengthened by shared determination and faith in each other. And the joys had far outweighed the difficulties: the birth of their children, the growth of their respective careers, the home they had built together both physically and emotionally. Dan approached the porch with Thomas riding triumphantly on his shoulders, the boy's small hands gripping his father's hat for balance. "We have a natural horseman here," Dan announced proudly. "Takes after his old man." "I ride good, Mama," Thomas declared. "You ride very well," Grace corrected gently, leaning down to kiss his flushed cheek as Dan brought him level with her. Dan's free arm circled her waist, pulling her and Sarah close for a family embrace. "Happy, Mrs. Baxter?" he asked, an echo of the question he had posed on their wedding night and countless times since. "Completely, Mr. Baxter," Grace replied, the answer as true now as it had been the first time. "And you?" "More than I ever dreamed possible," Dan said, his eyes still as blue as the Nebraska sky after all these years, warm with love for her and their children. As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created, Grace thought once more of that fateful day when her wagon axle broke miles from town. What had seemed like a disaster had been, in fact, the greatest stroke of fortune, leading her not just to North Platte, but to Dan, to love, to this family that filled her heart to overflowing. Some would call it coincidence or luck. Grace preferred to think of it as destiny, the moment when her life's journey had taken an unexpected but perfect turn, leading her exactly where she was meant to be. That evening, after the children were asleep, Grace added another entry to the journal Mrs. Wilson had given her on the eve of her wedding a journal now filled with 5 years of her own reflections, joining those of the women who had come before her. Today Thomas rode his first pony, she wrote, his father's hands steady behind him, just as they have been steady behind me through all our years together. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my wagon hadn't broken down that day, if Dan hadn't been the one to come along the trail. But perhaps some meetings are inevitable, perhaps we find our way to the people we're meant to love, one way or another. I'm grateful it happened, as it did a broken axle leading to a mended heart, a chance encounter blossoming into a lifetime of love. There's a lesson there about how life's apparent misfortunes can lead us to our greatest blessings, if only we have the courage to follow the unexpected path. Setting down her pen, Grace went to the window, gazing out at the moonlit prairie that stretched beyond their homestead. So vast, so full of possibility, much like the future that still lay before them. Whatever that future held, she would face it with Dan beside her, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating as one. And she would never forget how it all began with a broken wagon, miles from town, and a cowboy who stopped to help.